Okay. It's interesting. Okay, I think we're streaming, which I think means lectures started. So let's go with that. How's everybody doing this morning? Good, thank you. Does this look like everybody? Do you know if we're missing anyone? Should we drag our feet for a few minutes? Or should we just jump in? Cool. So who knows what we're talking about today?
Responsive design in SaaS.
Very good. That was like an underhand toss. You'd be surprised how often people are like, I don't know, you tell me. It's up on the screen. We're talking about responsive design in SaaS. We'll get to SaaS a little later. We're going to spend most of today talking about responsive design. Does anyone have an intuition for what that means?
Design that is responsive.
Good. So design that is responsive. What does responsive mean?
It reacts to things.
What sort of things?
Actions.
Actions, like user actions? No. Pardon? It's responsive to the size of the screen. Yeah, that's a little warmer. Yeah, a lot of times when we're talking about responsive design, the conversation that you're really having about responsive design is how does my page look at different screen sizes? So one way to approach this lecture is to just talk about like how do you make your page look good at different screen sizes. I'm going to try to do a little better than that and talk about like how do you think in terms of your web pages being like inherently responsive such that they can look good under all sorts of circumstances, and how CSS is built for you to make pages that are responsive even though most of us don't. So I have a few definitions here. So as I said, usually we're talking about viewport width. Like if you just want to like get the checkbox in like an interview, someone's like, tell me your thoughts about responsive design. You can say, well, different viewport widths, blah, 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 and they'll probably be, good chance they'll be happy with that. But responsive design is really about, it's an answer to the fact that when you're building for the web, you're building applications that need to be able to respond to various contexts. So they'll be on, even if you don't care that much about mobile, you should, but even if you don't, you're gonna have different screen sizes when people like plug in their monitor and put something up on the TV here, put it up on the monitor at their table, switch to a different computer. People are gonna be viewing this in all sorts of different contexts. They're gonna be resizing their window, half size, full size, zooming out. And every time you do something like that, the context that your app renders in changes. But it's also about the content. So if we were building marketing sites, and we're going to look at some examples of that, or something with like very static content, we can make a lot of decisions where we say like, I know that this is the stuff that needs to go on the page, and I know this is how it's supposed to look, and we can kind of just like take a nail and like hammer it in there. Just peg stuff to like certain pixel widths and heights and things. But when you're working on something like Tweeter, it's not really like that, right? It's you have an idea of the sort of thing that each tweet is going to look like, but what goes in there is up to the user, right? So you have like this inherent flexibility that your tweet components need to have and that the rest of the app needs to have as a result of that. You need to build that flexibility into the tweet component. And so that's part of what responsive design is. as well is not only variable context in terms of things like viewport size, zoom level, whether or not you're printing. I don't know how often you print off web pages, but you can write CSS that applies to the print view. So it'll look different when you print it versus when you view it in a browser. There used to be a type for Braille for some reason. I don't know how you used it, but you could write special CSS for if your page was going to render in Braille. So it's not just the context, it's also the content. So everywhere that you notice, oh, I have variable content here. Images can be different sizes. Someone can write 1 word or 1,000 words in this text box here. We could have 10 comments or 1,000 comments. Every time you notice some variable in the sort of content that's going to appear in your app, you should be thinking about making your design responsive. So just to illustrate this a little bit, made this little demo here. Here we have a bunch of identical text boxes. These are all paragraphs. They're just regular p tags. Identical with the content that's in them currently, but secretly what's going on is each one of these, even the one that I didn't apply any styles to, well, except like the white background and the drop shadow. Even the ones that aren't styled to do anything special when the content changes have rules built in that are the browser defaults that describe how it's going to respond to 2 letters versus 3 versus 4 versus 1,000, what's going to happen. HTML doesn't throw errors, right? CSS doesn't throw errors. It just does its best to figure out what you wanted, and it does something. If you do something wrong, it falls back to its defaults, and so it can be really useful to know what those defaults are. So when I put some stuff in this text box here, we're going to try to notice what rules are each of these playing by. And what would we have to do to find out, like, what's the difference between this one and this one? Because each one of them has a different plan. Let's try, what if they're empty, for starters? What do we notice about what happened here? One is longer than the rest, yeah. There are a bunch of other things going on here. One thing that you notice is that they don't wrap, right? So there's space enough here for, you know, these 4 squares could like line up here, but they don't, right? Why not? And this square could go up here, and maybe this one would stay where it is. But like, we could have some expectation built in about what would happen there, right? That if there's space, if we just refresh the page there, like now there's no space for anything to wrap up to the next line. We could have the expectation that if there's space, why wouldn't they wrap up to the next line? But that's not what happens, right? They remain vertical for some reason. Yeah, and we notice that all of them shrink down to like nothing except for 1, right? So let's fill it with text and see what happens. I used this example, like this line, like the first time I did this lecture, and then I figured out like exactly where like the line breaks and stuff. So I just kept using it because I know that when I start writing tool, that's when the lines break. So I'm just stuck with this now. Now we can kind of see like each one of these is doing a different thing, right? So now we have some more information, some more data about what rules each of these elements is playing by. So what does it look like this first one's doing? Let's start back from here and just focus on like what is the algorithm that this first element is following. Remember, it started off very, very tiny, right? just like just like a little box. So how would you describe what's going on there? Just with this first element. The text is wrapping, yeah. But it seems it wraps at a particular point, right? So this text doesn't wrap here, right? This text just keeps going. It also doesn't wrap like here. I don't know how to highlight, I promise. It doesn't wrap here, right? It wraps here. So where does it wrap and why? It is kind of because I set it to wrap there. What would cause it to wrap there? Margins and borders. In some circumstances, margins and borders can have an impact on where it wraps. What's really going on is that this component's going to grow to a certain max width. So below, I don't know, however many characters this is, up to about here. The browser algorithm, the layout algorithm is going, it's going like character by character, and it's deciding where to render each character, and it goes, well, can I put another character just beside the last character? And so the way it answers that question is it asks the p tag, how much space are you allowed to take up? Do you have an opinion about that, or can you just like keep going? And the p tag says like, yeah, I can keep going and going and going until this certain pixel width. And then you can't fit any more characters there, but we can go vertical all day. And that works great in a lot of situations, and that's why it's the browser default. So this one, other than a little bit of styling, this is basically unstyled. The only rules that this has is it knows to stop when it hits the width of its container, and its container is pegged to the width of the window. And it's got the same styling as all the other paragraphs do to give it like the white background and stuff. But this one is basically behaving as regular paragraphs do, right? I just go. But that's not the only layout plan we can give it, right? We can, like a big part of what CSS is overriding the browser defaults. I mean, I guess all that CSS is overriding browser defaults. Where the browser has a reasonable plan for rendering text. That's what HTML was built for, right? Is rendering like academic documents. You have like paragraphs and headings and bulleted lists, and sometimes you have images. Once in a while you might have an image in a paper, and sometimes you want that image to like float up beside a paragraph of text. And that's basically as complicated as it gets, right? You can change the colors. You can give it like background textures. Cool. And if you're doing that, then basic HTML is like really all you need, and a little bit of CSS. But now we're hacking that apart and building like web apps out of this like academic paper rendering tool, right? So that means that in a lot of cases, we don't want our tweeter to render as though it's an academic paper. We want it to render as though it's a user interface, right? So we apply all these overrides to make decisions about how things are going to render. So let's take a second and try to think about what the difference is in the rendering plans here for each one of these elements. Let's start with this one. What's it look like it's doing? As distinct from what this one is doing. Making the width however long the text is. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and this is going to just keep going and going and going. And you can see that there's some rule that says the background can't get wider than this. So if something overflows there, I don't know what's going to happen. So it's like we just go off the edge of the world here, and it'll just keep going and going and going. And it pushes like all this other content away. And it kind of destroys the page, which is why I'm going to delete it out of the DOM. But yeah, this thing's rule is just be like as wide as your content is, right? And that sounds reasonable. That sounds great. But if you're going to apply a rule like that, you want to think about where else you're going to apply a constraint, right? So in your Tweeter app, you might decide that like everything can fit on one line or two lines or something like that. Tweeter? Yeah, Tweeter. Yeah. I just said like, never mind. You might decide that everything can fit on one line or two lines. And you can style around that knowing that a tweet is never going to be longer than like 140 characters. You doing 140 characters? Is that the plan? Yeah. So this is quite dangerous to do if you have no idea how much text is going to go in there, right? You want to put the constraint in your CSS where you say like, just in case the text is longer than this, this is the plan. We're going to wrap it, or we're going to overflow it, or we're going to do something like that to it. Even though just applying, like just saying, be as wide as your content sounds like a totally reasonable thing to do. Layout and responsive design is all about constraints. Figuring out like where do I need to constrain things so that we can do whatever we want elsewhere. So as I said, this DOM element is pretty obtrusive, so I'm just gonna invisible it. Yeah. So what else is going on here? This one and this one look like basically the same thing, right? What might the difference be? The one on top is a bit more wrapped. Yeah, that's true. Like if you notice, this one breaks on this word, but in this one, the word winds up over here, right? And it gets constrained here. Yeah, it gets cut off here a little earlier. So there's another weird thing going on here where I'm going to go ahead and you guys don't have to pay attention. I'm just going to like take out all the spaces here. Oops, why did that work? Let's go. Yikes. So with spaces in there, these two behave like basically the same way, right? But when you take the spaces out, these two do something insane. Yikes. And this one wraps nicely, right? So there's some gotchas here. It turns out that what's going on here is I used my wisdom and experience to remember this property here, word wrap, break word. So by default, you'll get some crazy behavior where like the algorithm says, I don't want to break a word in the middle of the word. If the word is longer than the container, I don't know what to do. You're on your own, but I think it would be a mistake to just like cut that word in half and put it on the next line, right? And that's like a reasonable default, right? Because remember, if we're thinking about like academic papers and you have like the name of a molecule and it's like really, really, really long, you don't want to cut that in half because like maybe then like that looks like, well, we're talking about like two separate molecules, and like the whole point of your paper gets muddled by that. So instead you just go like, okay, if the word is too long to fit the container for some reason, just do the crazy thing and just like make it as long as it has to be. But the crazy thing is crazy. So CSS gives us overrides. So this is, I just kind of put this in here because some of you are going to be testing your Tiny app by going like this, making tweets like this. And then you're going to get this bleeding off the edge of your tweet container thing and be like baffled and horrified. And I just saved you like, 45 minutes of Googling or something. Can I get, I just ruined that. Yeah, so then down here we have two more like identical looking ones. How can we describe what these guys are doing? It's containing the overflow. Yeah, exactly. So this text wants to overflow, right? And this containers plan is if something is asking you for more space, no problem. Just like chop it off and we'll like hide it behind the curtain, right? But I told you that every one of these is different, right? We don't have identical ones. So what's the difference between these two, do you think? You have to examine it, yeah? Scroll over. That's it. This container won't scroll. This container will. So again, depending on what you're doing with this element, you might want one behavior or the other, right? So if you're doing something like a tooltip, like Wikipedia has like that link preview thing. Maybe you want to, you know what I'm talking about? On Wikipedia now you can hover over a link and it'll give you like a little article summary. Maybe you can replicate that with like a tooltip, or like you have something that's like an email or a file and you can hover over and get like a longer version of the subject line. And you just want to have like the first like 40 characters or something and then cut it off, right? So you don't want it to scroll because then you might get some weird behavior where like someone sees a scroll bar and then they end up like scrolling in the tooltip and that like confuses like their normal scrolling. You don't want that, so you just want it to cut off, right? Then again, maybe the thing that you want is for, to be able to get at the content. That's generally a good rule too, right? So yeah, and then just duplicate that. And this is like the same kind of deal, but horizontal. And that's pretty common for like, I think in general, it's an anti-pattern to make containers scroll vertically. Like if you have like a page that scrolls at all, and then you make like one pane scroll vertically, I feel like that's kind of weird in a lot of cases. Like some designs use it. I think it's almost always like confusing and janky. But you might have something like a sidebar, right? And just that sidebar is supposed to scroll. It's like a menu independent of the main body. In that case, you want any overflow to just like scroll independent of what the rest of the page is doing. So these are all a bunch of different plans for responding to different content, and this is just text, right? So like as we're going through and talking about responsive design in general, we should be thinking, okay, what would happen if we put like 50 times as much text in this container? Would it be a disaster? So do we need a constraint on these titles? The title can't be longer than 20 characters. Or do we need to figure something out? And then if we get that part right, then when we're talking about how does the app look at different viewport widths, that question suddenly becomes a lot simpler because we know how to handle our content. Any questions about this stuff so far? Oh, like how does managing the content make handling viewport widths easier? Um, so generally what goes wrong with different viewport widths is that as you resize the window or you like view it on different devices, you get stuff like text bleed or things look cramped or whatever, right? So if we were going to make this little app mobile responsive, so that is, it would look good on web and on mobile, I would want to make sure that these boxes know how to behave in general. So if they're like overflow handling box, they handle overflow the right way. And if they're like a word wrapping box, the words wrap the right way. And then when I'm doing my responsive design, I can just think of it as like a box and I don't really care what's in it. So it lets me abstract away the actual content in there and just focus on like, well, if the screen is 480 pixels wide, then how wide should this box be? I can focus on that and I don't have to think about like, well, what's this box going to contain? Does that make sense? Cool. So I thought design in general is a lot about like gut feel and intuition and taste. So I thought what we would do is look at a bunch of examples that I found. Some are simple, some are more sophisticated, some are good, some are bad. And just look at what they do, how they handle responsive. How's that sound? Thank you. So many of you may find yourselves doing like some sort of e-commerce site like this. This is just like, not a totally random one. I actually bought one of these boards, but like this could be like any sort of site that's like selling some product where they're like, look at all of the stuff it does. Here's how you buy one. Here's our blog that we have like 3 articles in from 2016. And they're pretty samey. It's like, you have here's some images of the product, here's some features, things like that. You can go in water in this one. It's pretty cool. Big hero video in this case, but like hero image in a lot of cases. And pretty standard menu bar logo in the top left. Couple products. These are like, this is the one with the single motor, double motor. And then they have like kind of a sub nav here, right? So when you're building something like this, it's what I was talking about before, where like you kind of have the luxury of knowing that this content isn't going to change too much. So if you're the one building this, the thing that you have to worry about is you're not really necessarily in charge of this copy. So you want to be flexible to like, if they decide that they just want to have like this one word in there, or they want to have like juiced single motor and double motor electric skateboard or something, you want to be like flexible to that. Oh, and I clicked the thing now. You want to be flexible to like, what if they say they want another nav item, something like that. But in general, you have a lot of freedom to just kind of say like, this is going to be the content on the page. I'm just going to make it look like you said you wanted it to look, and that's that. So when we talk about being responsive in this case, mostly what we care about is like accommodating copy changes, and of course viewport width, right? So the thing that I want you to notice about, we're kind of going to go like section by section. We won't do the whole thing. Like what I want you to notice about this first section, this is the part above the fold. Is that a phrase you've heard before? Has anyone heard that before? Above the fold? Okay. It's like a design term. It comes from print design, I think newspaper design specifically. It's like when you buy a newspaper, it's like folded up and it's like sitting in a pile of more newspapers, and you just see like the part that like the way it's folded. There's just the stuff that's like on top, and then there's a whole bunch of stuff underneath that you can't see, right? So you talk about the stuff that you can see that like sells the newspaper and catches your attention as the part that's above the fold. And if that doesn't catch your attention, you're not going to pick it up and look at the other stuff. So on websites, above the fold means the stuff you can see on your screen before you scroll. So all this stuff is below the fold. Above the fold is just what we see right now. So the above the fold view is pretty important. And the thing that I want you to notice here is that there's an information hierarchy. We're going to talk a lot about information hierarchy. There's kind of a concept of like what's most important on the page and what's second most important and third, fourth, and needs to be there but doesn't really matter. Or doesn't need to be there at all but is. So just without talking about like how you know what the information hierarchy is, you might have some intuitions about what the designer's opinion was of what's the most important thing on this page. Any ideas? What up? Yeah, the big video that takes up like 90% of the screen, right? Is probably the most important thing, right? They want you to see the product in action. It's like a product that looks cool when it's moving. So that video is huge and important, right? What's the second most important piece of content? Navigation? Okay. Why do you think navigation? So that's why navigation is useful. But what about the navigation on this page gives you the idea that it's important? So they can buy things? Yeah, because there's like a call to action there, right? They want you to, like, if you're here and you know what you want, they want you to be able to get to it, right? So navigation is pretty important. You notice that there are two nav bars, right? Which one do you think is more important? The orange one or the black one? Yeah, I think the black one. Why the black one? How do you know? Higher contrast? It's true. Yeah. Yep. There's one more like pretty important factor in information hierarchy that makes the video more important than the nav bar, more important than the sub-nav bar. Anyone want to guess what it is? The title? Oh, like here? Yeah, like the logo. Oh, yeah, the title copy. Yeah. The top level header. Yeah, for sure. So how do you know that this is more important than, like, say, this? Yeah, it's a larger font. It's bigger, right? So it's like it's so obvious it almost goes without saying that the bigger a thing is on the page, the more important it probably is, right? Like that's almost like it sounds like so simple that, you know, I don't know about you, but like my brain wants to be like, no, it's more sophisticated than that. That's not art, man. And design is basically art. But like if you think about it, like how big something is and how important it is, like correlates like really strongly, right? And then the other thing that I was gonna mention was like how high on the page it is, right? So how high up and how far to the left something is says a lot about how important it is. So that's why these logos are so important, right? They're all the way up and all the way to the left. Prime spot. And so scroll down here, and I think the next thing that I want to talk about is how this page looks on different viewport sizes. So without knowing, without like trying it yet, what do you think would be a reasonable thing to happen as the viewport shrinks? As space becomes more scarce? The navigation bar changes for sure. How might it change?
I think the more you shrink it like this, and then like, the more you close it in, I think it might change to like the three things, like the three lines, and you can click on it. Yeah, the hamburger.
Yeah,
And then,
yeah.
And then like that's how you might open up the nav bar and just like extend like that.
Yeah, totally. So as we shrink the viewport, space becomes more scarce. We have to make some decisions about like what we actually want to maintain on the page. We might start hiding elements, and we don't want them to be completely gone usually. So we might hide them in like a hamburger menu or something. Technical term.
It's actually called.
Yeah, it's called a hamburger menu.
Oh really?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought you were just joking.
We just make these words up, and then they stick. That's how web dev works. So let's see what happens as we shrink this window. As we start to shrink, like there's so much going on here, you guys. Oh. Like if you ever want to like appreciate like HTML and CSS, try making an app in Canvas. Just like throw up your hands, be like, I don't get CSS. I'm better off just like saying I want it to be this big and I want it to be at this XY coordinate, and just make an app in HTML5 Canvas. You can. You just go like, I just want this text here, and I want like there to be a square here. I want things to be positioned. And like pretty soon you start like doing stuff like I want to move this thing over just a little bit. It's like, okay, but you got to like tear down your canvas and redraw it, and you know, your words don't know to wrap. It's just like text that you decide you wanted on the screen, and so you have to like write an algorithm to like do word wrap, and you realize that's really hard. It'll change your mind about CSS if you think CSS is a disaster. It's like there's so much going on here as this shrinks. Like notice where as the pixels become more scarce, notice where they become more scarce from. In this case, it's like in the headers, we notice it's like the margins that get chewed up first, right? Watch this. Nothing else changes. The video becomes kind of smaller, but in the header, nothing else changes as long as there's margin, right? That's the first thing that gives up space. And then when that space runs out, it's just like this unclaimed land between the left nav stuff and the right nav stuff. That unclaimed land just gets chewed up. And how much of that can we chew up before something else happens? So we get to about here, and someone's made a decision that like once you cross that threshold, the next thing we're going to give up is like we like this elbow room between the elements here. So people who are in such a hurry to buy this board, as they like come crashing in with their cursor, they have like a larger hit area, are less likely to click the wrong thing. But when it gets this small, maybe it's time to give up on that elbow room and you can just get cozy with your neighbors. Then we chew away at that white space a little bit, and then that's a big breakpoint, right? The thing that you anticipated, which is now we've done away with like this nav bar is getting too crowded. Like at about here, you're starting to think, you know, if we lose much more horizontal space, this is just going to look like a mess, and we're going to lose that hierarchy. Or we're going to lose like the clarity and like the differentiation between elements. So who wants hamburgers? And then, yeah, that's kind of like a lopsided hamburger. But yeah, like we know what that does, right? There are all our menu items. And the information hierarchy here is actually maintained just in a different way, right? So these are the black nav items, and these are the orange nav items. And so the more important ones are up top, and the less important ones are on the bottom. And we keep all that consistent. So we're not going to talk too much about what goes on here. I'm just going to do like the same sort of thing, and then we're going to like move on to another example because I'm bored of this one. So this is the same kind of thing, like chew away at the margins until, you know, like as long as you can. And then there's a decision here where like we're not going to chew away at any more margin. we're going to keep this margin between these two elements. And we're going to start wrapping text instead, no problem. And then at some point we hit that breakpoint and we go, how about instead we make it look kind of like this div is like kind of sticking out and there's like maybe more of it off screen. We're just going to get rid of that margin entirely. I think if we get even smaller, yeah, then we switch to, instead of having 3 items side by side, we're going to like kind of go like whoop and like make this one full width. I wonder if we can get these images to wrap. No, we can't. I think that looks silly. I think they should have wrapped them. So yeah, that's how this competently built but ultimately unimpressive e-commerce site does responsive design. And if we want to see what it actually looks on mobile, what do we do? Developer tools, yeah. I thought someone was going to say go to the site on your phone because phones can do that. But yeah, if we, I went straight to the mobile view. But on your browser, if you're using the good browser, the button's right here. If you're using like Chrome or whatever, I think it's in a similar place. We have responsive design mode on major browsers that do that sort of thing. If you didn't know, you can click that and you keep your dev tools just like normal, and this is the same page, same load. The page hasn't reloaded. And you can see what it looks like on a mobile device. So here I can choose from a preset list of devices, or I can just set the device width that I want. I can change the orientation, so that's how it looks in landscape. And I can even set the throttling. What does throttling mean? Yep, loading speed. So it can be an issue. It can be an issue with like media-heavy sites and apps, how it looks when things are loading in. So it's possible to load your HTML first, right? And then like your link tag that links to your style sheet you have to go get that in another request, right? So the HTML page says, hi, I'm all the HTML. Can you go get the CSS, please, so that I look good? It has to go and get all the images, and you can have, on slower connections, this like crazy kind of like rapid Lego looking thing as like different style sheets or maybe broken up into different files all come in at different times. So you can see whether that looks terrible or not with throttling. That's one way that you can get that. No, it's not too bad. It's not too bad. Depending on where in the world you are. But in like North America, having a YouTube video and like a dozen-ish images is not really considered media heavy. Yeah, so let's move on to, I really like news sites for like layout and design questions. So today we're going to look at the BBC. And if we're interested, we can like check out some other sites too and see how they approach things differently. But the BBC definitely has an information hierarchy. Does anyone disagree with that? Is that a controversial statement at all? Good, then we should all agree on what the most important element on the page is. What's the most important element on this page? Coming in? Top news. The one on the top left. This one? How do you know? It's the biggest element. Anything else? There's stuff beside it. The stuff beside it is smaller. It's furthest up, and it's furthest to the left. Does anyone have any other candidates for most important element on the page? Logo? The BBC logo over here? Pretty important. Anything else?
So we look at this page. Is it the way how they put the headline in a real life newspaper? Because this page is very different from the previous page, the Scable page, right? The Scable page it is a commercial website, and this page is like a news website.
Yep.
And like in my opinion, looks very like the newspaper navigation.
Mm.
Right. So just curious, like you can see the biggest thing, the biggest element in the page is the headline. So yeah, are they same like layout or yeah, same layout when they design the page?
Are they, you're asking, I'm not sure what you're asking. Oh, so did BBC.com borrow design cues from print design, from print newspaper? Yeah, absolutely. So like a huge part of web design is influenced by print design, and that's like good in a lot of ways because like print designer, like everybody who had design acumen, visual design acumen, for a long time was in print because that was the only way that, I guess it's not strictly true, it's like a little too absolute, but most of design thinking around like layout and typography and stuff for a long time was in print. So especially for news, yeah, a lot of the cues are drawn from print design. And so the BBC isn't like the most extreme example of this even. If you look at nytimes.com, yeah, it is. The New York Times website looks like a newspaper, right? Like I don't think it's even like a question that that this is heavily inspired by newspapers. Like you could print this out and fold it up and sell it at a newspaper stand. So yeah, and that's where we get terms like masthead. Like this is like this top section here. It's called the masthead. Where we get terms like above the fold. Those all come from print, right? Even terms that you don't think of as from print, like boilerplate. Boilerplate is like a term that comes from. Is that a term that you guys know yet? It comes up a lot around final projects. Like boilerplate is like when you have like a bunch of code that you're going to use that like you just know like I just have to take all of this code and just like drop it into my project and then I can start working on it. It's kind of like a template, and that comes from print. Boilerplate is like if this were actually print, well, this page just keeps going and going. Boilerplate is like this stuff kind of like often at like the end of a page where like it's on every page and like it's the same every time. Which also came from print for reasons that I don't really remember. I think the plate part was from like you just had like a metal plate that just had like all the text like permanently etched into it, and you're just like stamp. And then all of like the content, like the news stories and stuff, you'd have to like typeset. That's off topic. The typography history lecture is not in this curriculum. But yeah, this is definitely influenced by print design, and I think this is influenced by mobile design in a lot of ways. So it's where the New York Times site looks a lot like, you know, like each of these things are links that you can click on, but it doesn't try that hard to make them look that way. It tries hard to pretend like it's just like text on a page. Whereas on the BBC website, a lot of these items look like buttons. They look like nice, large hit targets for a finger. Whereas like for the New York Times and UIs in general, like clicking up here would be a real pain if you were using like this pointing device, right? But using a cursor, it's a much more precise pointing device, so a header like this is fine. Anyway, so I want to get into what this looks like when it degrades. Any predictions? I say degrade, that's the wrong word. When it gets smaller. Smaller isn't worse. What's going to happen to this page as the viewport shrinks? The elements on the right might wrap down. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. There's like, as we lose horizontal space, it's natural to take horizontally positioned elements and just like flip them. For sure. Any other ideas? Is the top nav bar going to go into a hamburger? I don't remember, but good guess. Plausible, right? Any other ideas? Okay, let's just see what happens. So again, for the first bit, you can tell that there's like, that this page wasn't built for this screen width. It was built for like this screen width or something. And then it was like whatever else you have, just like, you know, have margin all day, right? So if this was on like a 10,000 pixel wide monitor, it would still look like, it would still have this, what is this like? 1200 something pixel layout. So down to like 1200 something pixels, it just chews away at that margin, and we get like a bunch of things shrink a little bit, and you can see the text wrapping inside of those buttons. And then we hit that breakpoint, right? Hang on to that word breakpoint. We're going to talk about it after the break. So it's like exactly what you said, right? The items on the right, they maintained their 4-item grid. But yeah, they wrapped underneath, and they actually got bigger, right? Now, if there's any doubt about what the most important item on the page is, now it's pretty obvious, right? It's this story. But this is probably, you might consider this like the tablet view. Let's see if we keep going smaller and smaller, what ideas they had about the mobile view. So what do we make of that? It removed almost all of the media images, yeah. Yeah, so they actually further explicated the information hierarchy here, right? They said, okay, we can afford to do away with the other images on the screen in favor of holding up this headline story that we have. They also made the decision that they're gonna hide the image and keep the text, right? So maybe drawing cues from the New York Times, which also looks different. I feel like the New York Times actually gets like imagier when it gets smaller. But like the full width version is, it's like a lot of like text. The BBC, when it gets smaller, it goes, you know what? This is print news. We can just have the text there. I don't know if you get really, really small. It's just the same. So yeah, to maintain your information hierarchy, you have like a lot of tools that you can play with. You have your white space that you can distribute, and you can like program your layout to deal with white space differently. Like this item should always have its elbow room. This item can grow and shrink with however much space it wants. This item is always as small as it can be. You have showing and hiding elements. So hide the images, keep the text. You have reflowing the layout. So you have things, you have like 3 things beside each other. You can make like, you can put one on top and full width, or you can like just flip the whole row into a column. These are all tools that you can reach for when you when you start dealing with information hierarchy, you want to maintain the same information hierarchy at various screen sizes. Okay, I'm gonna skip Peaceful Restaurant. It's not as good. I'll show it to you real quick. It's like, I had this in here before as like an example of like a bad site, and then they actually like improved it since I included it. So I'm just gonna show you real quick. It's like, you know, very like looks lovingly handcrafted, is how I'm gonna choose to put that. And as you get smaller, it like kind of does like, it looks a little odd, but like nothing is like ew. It doesn't like, it's still readable. Everything's still like, the image is resized properly. And they even have like this hamburger menu. Huh. And I don't know about the color choice. I don't know how accessible those colors are, but yeah, they did like a way better job than they did when I first created this. I want to talk about Amazon though, because Amazon does a weird thing and it illustrates something important about when you're actually like doing a material design, responsive design, something to keep in mind. So watch what Amazon does as we chew away at this horizontal space. These images kind of get smaller. We do like a little bit of like just this like white space negotiating. Remove an element. And then like when you get to like tablet view and smaller, it just kind of like, that's not the window going off the screen. It just like stops trying. Really, Amazon? And yeah, we can see like in mobile view, it's just like, imagine going to Amazon.ca on your phone and be like looking at this. You'd be like, what slapdash 2-bit operation is this? I'm not giving them my credit card info. Even though they have a hamburger menu. Doesn't help. So what's going on, Amazon? That wasn't directed at Amazon, that was directed at you guys. What's going on, students? Pardon? They probably want you to download the app. Yeah, good guess. That's very insightful. Unfortunately wrong. Well, I don't know if it's wrong, they probably do. But there's something else going on here too. That's a really good answer though. They have a mobile site. What does that mean? Same website designed for mobile. Yeah, exactly. So that's what's actually going on here is if you go to Amazon.ca on your phone, you actually don't see this. You see like a reasonable site. So remember how I said when we go into responsive design mode, like there's no page refresh here. The page hasn't refreshed. That means that we're still using the same result from the same HTTP request I made when we were at like full like desktop mode. So I think we skipped talking about this, right? UA, that stands for user agent. We didn't talk about that before, right? Yeah. So the user agent, does anyone know what the user agent is? Okay. The user agent is basically the combination of your browser and your device. It's like when you make an HTTP request, you send over information about what your user agent is. So you're telling the server what kind of thing you are, and that might dictate how the server responds. So if we refresh the page, I think I have to set my user agent to make this do like a reasonable thing. Let me try it in Chrome. Maybe Chrome has a user agent set up. Yeah, there we go. So I think I like messed with my user agent on Firefox. I'm not going to fix it like right now. But oops. Yeah, so in Chrome we can see that when we reload the page in mobile responsive mode, we're actually looking at a different view that like it doesn't scroll horizontally in that weird way. I think it looks crowded, but I mean they're trying to sell you like 1,000 things at once, so that's, you know, their business. It's like they send you over like a different thing, like a different site, basically. So in Amazon's case, we're still at Amazon.ca, right? So something's happening on the server where like they receive your HTTP request and they send back different content depending on what your user agent is, right? There's like some logic in there. If you imagine this is running on an Express server, which it might be for all I know, it's like in the app.get, there's like an if the user agent is in this list of user agents or matches this pattern, send them the desktop version, otherwise send them the mobile version. Another approach to that is like what Wikipedia does. Do y'all know how Wikipedia mobile works? You ever seen this before? Pardon? They have, yeah, so Wikipedia has, let's look at this article. Wikipedia has this thing where I think if you want the mobile view, you just go like m dot whatever you were doing before. Oh, it's the other way around. Okay. So it's like language, then the M is for mobile.wikipedia.org. So if you go to Wikipedia on your phone, you're sending over like, hi, I'm a phone, I'd like to view this page, please. And what Wikipedia does is it sends you back a redirect. So whereas Amazon just like manipulates the content on the fly and sends you back different stuff, Wikipedia will send you back a redirect. Go ask for a mobile site instead. So two approaches to basically the same thing, with the difference that if I copy paste this link into Slack, you'll have good evidence, that'll be wrong in this case, that like I was doing this on my phone. So sometimes you see like, you know, people post like n.m.wikipedia.org links, and you can go like, oh, that person was probably on their phone when they did that. And yeah, the difference between the mobile view and the desktop view is that in the desktop view, it's about a battle in the 100 Years' War, and in mobile, it's about a beach volleyball player. That doesn't sound right. No, in the desktop view, it's like you have like a lot more Chrome. You have like your sidebar. Things take up a lot more space. And in the mobile view, they've just like they've just done same content, different layout, right? And they've trimmed a bunch of stuff out. They have your hamburger, but they've taken a lot of the cruft away to make it easier to interact with on a phone. So I'm gonna drop a new term on you. We're doing responsive design when we make our layout respond to like the viewport width and the content. We're doing adaptive design when we have like just a whole different plan. So adaptive design is the thing that you Google if you're trying to do this Wikipedia plan, or the thing that Amazon does where you send back different content for different devices. That's responsive design versus adaptive design, and you can kind of do both. But you're probably just going to do responsive. Yeah. So any questions so far? We're about to take a break. Then we'll talk about like some of the tools that we use for actually doing responsive designs. Okay, so let's take a break. Be back in like 10 minutes or something.
That's usually what you want to make it sound worse than it is. Break it right up on the player.
Okay, so usually what I like to do after our break is talk a lot about Flexbox, and then forget about talking about media queries and SAS until like the very end, and then keep you for like 20 minutes after because I need to cover those. I'm going to try not to do that this time, so I'm going to like blow through the Flexbox stuff that I wanted to talk about in favor of getting to like some of the other stuff that are like, it's like you got to know about this and you got to know about this, and like, okay, box is checked. But if you feel like Flexbox is something that you want to become proficient in and understand better, please find me after, because I have like a whole, like I could do a whole lecture on Flexbox, and I think it's like the most valuable tool that you can learn for like doing whatever you want with layout. That and CSS Grid. Not Bootstrap Grid, CSS Grid. So I just want to get a feel for how much y'all know about Flexbox as of right now. The end of today? You talk about Flexbox stuff? Okay. That's good. Okay, let's start here. Who here's heard of Flexbox? That's pretty good. That's almost everybody. Well, everybody who's listening. Who here has used Flexbox? Okay. About half or something, maybe a third. What did you think of Flexbox when you used it? Good tool, hard tool? Very useful for Tweeter, for sure. What did you find? What did you find was useful about it? What problems were you able to solve with it?
Just line everything up instead of like positioning it in like an exact pixel location. You just line it up in a box and you can space between and then space around. So it like goes to the corner of the boxes without.
So Flexbox is a really useful tool for lining things up along one axis. And as the name implies, it's not just about lining things up, it's about arranging them and being flexible with the space that they share, right? So like everything, every element on this page right now, every element on this page right now is negotiating for space, right? Trying to figure out how big must I be, how big do I want to be if I can get away with it, how much space do I want to take up, and what do my neighbors and parents and siblings think of that, right? So the markup for this page is like pretty straightforward. Everything's in a main tag. We have a section up here and a section down here. Each section has a bunch of divs in it. This other section, this section has a bunch of P's in it. So the first thing I want to talk about with Flexbox is that both of these, the way that you make Flexbox happen for an element is by setting display flex on it. So display flex defines an element as a flex container. All of its items are going to be flex items. Doesn't matter what they are. It doesn't matter if they're inline elements or block elements or what. They're just going to be flex items, and Flexbox is going to treat them the same way. So in this case, we have a bunch of divs. In this other case, we have a bunch of P tags, and it doesn't matter in either case. They're just flex items. They get treated the same way. Flexbox sees them just as boxes. Boxes that have an opinion about how big they want to be, but just boxes nonetheless. So the first thing that we're doing up here is we're talking about flex grow and flex shrink. Is kind of putting the cart before the horse a little bit, but I just kind of want to show you the sort of thing that you can do with Flexbox before we talk about just basic usage of it. So one of the things you can do with Flexbox is you can say, of all these elements, all of these divs are set to be like 80 by 80, or as much space as they can take up. And the way that you define how much space they're allowed to take up is you don't, in which case the browser does a sensible default. And in general, the rule with CSS is if you're happy with the default, use the default. If you're not happy with the default, change it, override it. So the default for how things will take up extra space, so these like 80 by 80 boxes kind of look around and they go like, and just take up as much space as they're allowed. We use the flex grow property. So if there's no flex grow property set, then implicitly it's set to 1. And that just means like, that's just like a fraction of the available space. So you get 1/n, where n is the number of elements, the number of elements negotiating for space. You get 1 portion, you get 1 portion, you get 1 portion, you get 1 portion. You can tell these elements that this blue one is more important than this purple one. So I want the purple one to yield a bunch of space. Like, let the blue one go first. So the flex grow property says that no matter how much space you have to distribute, make sure that the blue one gets 6 times as many as the purple one. And the red one gets twice as many as the purple one. And the green one is set to 0. And 0 just means like don't grow at all. If there's extra space, you just keep to yourself. And that's pretty cool because like now as this container grows and shrinks, the maximum width, the number of pixels that they have to distribute among each other changes, but the ratio always stays the same. So this is really good when you want to do that. This is really good when you want to maintain ratios for like design reasons. Like the logo should always be this big relative to the text, which should be this big. Stuff like that. Stuff where you're trying to resize images or you're trying to space out menu items. So you could imagine this purple one being like the left side. You know how like nav bars and like your tweeter headers often have like the stuff on the left and the stuff on the right, and the middle is just kind of like this like extra space. You can imagine this being that extra space, and then the left and right kind of being constrained to the left and right should take up as much space as they need and distribute the rest to the stuff in the middle. So you can control that with Flexbox. Flexbox also determines how, as things shrink, how those things yield space. So right now these elements are pretty comfortable, pretty happy. But as I shrink them, notice what happens to the words. Which box is reflowing? It's just the middle, right? The boxes on the left and right aren't reflowing at all. Space is getting more and more scarce, but they just hang on to what they had. It's that middle one that goes like, oh no, I can wrap. It's cool. I'll shrink. I can still shrink. And it just keeps doing that. And then only when it gets to a certain point that you define or that's defined for you, it goes, okay, I actually can't shrink anymore. I did my best. This is as small as I can go. Someone else is going to have to give up space. And now it's the one on the right, and it starts shrinking. And only when it gets to that min width, the one on the left shrinks. So that's flex grow and flex shrink. Those are the 2 magic words you need to know if you want to start playing with this behavior. And you can look at that example in the repo fluid layout example, if you want. That's all we're going to talk about because with respect to flex grow, flex shrink, because I want to talk about like a few other patterns that are going to really come in handy when you're trying to build interfaces. So when you're designing an interface, you often end up with something that looks like this. See if I can make that a little bigger. You end up with something that looks like this. It's like, in this case, it's like Ipsum text. But it's just boxes. Just boxes and boxes and boxes. Or you might end up with a design that looks much simpler. But this is kind of the same idea. It's like, this is what I want the layout to be like. It's just boxes. And that's great for Flexbox users because Flexbox, as I mentioned, just treats everything as boxes, right? Everything's a box, period, right? That's a little different than how normal works. In normal, everything's treated as like text or not text, kind of. They're treated as block level elements and inline elements. That layout plan, by the way, is called flow layout. So if you're looking for the term, like, it's not Flexbox, it's not Bootstrap Grid, it's not CSS Grid, it's like just normal layout. The term for that is flow layout. That's what the that's what that plan is with like block elements and inline elements. Those are words from flow layout, whereas flex item, flex container, those are words from Flexbox. Does that make sense? So I'm going to switch over to the whiteboard here for a second. Yeah. So in flow layout, remember flow layout is like the default for like HTML. What was HTML originally designed for? What was HTML originally built to do? Kind of make websites. I said it earlier, it was built for basically academic papers. Yeah. Yeah, it was built to render academic papers. So you take plain text, mark it up, and then you can render it in a browser. And then like all like the hyperlinking stuff was like part of it, and people realized like, oh, you can make like whole like information databases, like, and have all these articles linked. And then like people started noticing like, oh, you could do stuff like other than, you could have pages that aren't papers. It could just be like indices of other pages and stuff like that. And that's how you got websites. But it was like originally built for academia, right? To render academic content, text content, right? So that means all of the HTML defaults are based on text. So this is how flow layout thinks of your HTML layouts, HTML elements. So like you have div tags, p tags, h1 tags. Those are examples of block level elements, right? What does block mean? Yeah, exactly. A block level element will take up as much horizontal space as it can. And unless you like do some wrangling, block level elements will render one on top of the other. They'll stack, right? If you want things to line up next to each other and play nice next to each other on the horizontal axis, you have to use what kind of element? What's kind of the complement to block level elements? Inline elements, yeah. So inline elements are things like spans, strong tags, links, A tags, right? So you can have a bunch of text, and then you have an inline element, and then like another inline element. So it's like text node, DOM node. This one's like maybe like a strong tag. Text node, DOM node. This one's maybe an A tag, and like they might have text nodes themselves. And so what we end up doing with flow layout is we start kind of saying like, okay, so imagine this header is like really like a paragraph. You know, it's like Twitter header thing, or this nav bar or something. Let's say it's really like a paragraph, and each of the like the profile picture and like the share button and stuff, those are sort of like inline elements, right? Those are sort of like, you know, bold sections of text or links or something. So you end up kind of like making this analogy between block level elements and like inline elements, and you know, well, block level elements are like these vertical things, inlines are like horizontal things. So we can just like use that as a metaphor for building like something that looks like that looks like a tweet. We can just like take a block level element, like an element of text, and fill it with not text, and just like kind of, go right. So with Flexbox, we don't think of it that way. We just think of like boxes and boxes and boxes, and like who cares what it is? It's just a box. You have text in there, great. You have images in there, great. It's just like a circle. Okay, cool. It's a circle, but it's in a box. So with Flexbox, I mentioned before, I'll say it a few more times, Flexbox is about aligning things on one axis. So whenever you have a flex container, it's going to line up its things along one axis. And you can wrap, right? So you can go like, if you're going horizontal, you can go like 1, 2, 3, oh, I'm out of space, wrap to the next line. But that's not the default. By default, Flexbox is just going to put everything on one row, right? So if you have a flex container, the flex container can be a block level element, but everything inside of it plays by Flexbox rules. That's pretty important too, is like you don't have to opt into only using Flexbox. You can use Flexbox on just one element. You can set display flex on like your body tag, and then everything's a Flexbox. And then you go like, well, this element really is just like kind of a bunch of text, so I'm going to switch back to flow layout. So you just go display block on that element. But now that we have these flex items and this flex box, now we have a lot of power over how these elements distribute. So before we jump ahead, the way to get this behavior is just display flex. As soon as you do that on an element, all of that element's children are playing by Flexbox rules. The children's children are not necessarily, but the direct children are. So now we have a lot of power as to like how we're going to arrange these items, right? So we often end up in this situation where we might be talking about like a nav bar. So we have, say, a logo. And then we have some nav items, and then we have some stuff that we want to wind up over here. In flow layout, this is kind of hard to do, right? We end up doing something with, like we give this thing, we figure out like how wide these elements are, and then we give this thing like a big margin that we think corresponds to the width of these things, and we set these things to float, right? So that what we're kind of doing is like positioning them down here and then convincing them like, no, you can come hang out up here, it's okay. And we kind of have to coax the elements into just like kind of sliding into place there. And that's really unnatural, and you've probably felt frustrated, I hope, with doing this with floats and margins and things, because it sucks. With Flexbox, this is like exactly the sort of thing that Flexbox is for, right? Like we have a bunch of items in a row, and we just want to like distribute them, right? So in Flexbox, the way we would do this is we would think of one way to accomplish this is we could think of the stuff on the left as one element and the stuff on the right as one element. And then we tell Flexbox, just put as much space between them as you can. So when we're distributing things along the axis that they're being distributed on, we use the justify content property. It's just a thing you got to remember. And what justify content does is it takes like everything in the box and it like moves it around. It decides how it's gonna lay out. So by default, it's flex start. Everything's gonna jam up against the start of the flex container. You can set it to flex end. Everything will jam up against the end of the container. Or in this case, we want as much space between these two elements as possible. So we use the property space between. And then each of these elements, like these can be flex boxes too. So this is a flex container, this is a flex container, and these are whatever. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? I know I'm like blowing through this. I wish we had like the whole lecture just for Flexbox, but yes. Couldn't quite hear you. Which element would you put it on? You would put it on the flex container, so you'd put that on this element. The same element that has a display flex, you would put the justify content, because you're justifying the content of this element. In general, yeah, there are properties that you put on flex items, like the items inside the container. But in general, most of your flex boxing is done on the container itself. And then the children just like go, okay, yeah, whatever. I'll play by those rules. So that's great. You can do all kinds of stuff, like these boxes in here are happy to like space out evenly. They're happy to space out with like a little bit of margin, space out as much as they can. I'll go over here, I'll go over here. And those are all the justify content property. So like, if you want to play with that, you can open up your DevTools. And this is, in my opinion, the best way to learn CSS is you just like open up the DevTools and you play with the properties. So I've selected my flex container. I know because it says display flex. And right on the element, I'm going to go I'm going to put a border around it so that I like so I can see what's going on. This is a bad example because they're all flex growing. I'm going to come back to this in a second. First, I'm going to talk about align items. Actually, I'm just going to do that right here. I don't think the whiteboard's really working out. So these items all have an opinion about how they're going to like distribute their space horizontally. That's the flex grow property, is saying of all this space that's left, take up as much as you can. I can go grab one of these divs and go. Yeah. Never use important. That's a rule that I'm breaking right now. I just want all of them to be like the same size so that I can do. Actually, I want that down here. This must be. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I just did all that to set up this demo of like the justify content properties and then the align items properties. So I was saying about like, yeah, the best way to learn CSS, go into the dev tools, play with the thing. Yeah. So for like all your properties, if I want to see like how justify content works, I'll go justify content, hit tab, and then I have like all these different options that I can thumb through, and I can just be like, what does center look like? What does end look like? What does flex end look like? Turns out those are like synonyms. They're like the same thing from like different generations of the CSS spec. So you have end start, right? So if I want everything to jam up against the end of the container, I use end. If I want everything to jam up against the front of the container, I use start. Inherit and initial have like their own behavior. Left in this case is the same as start by coincidence. Right is the same as end. And then you have your space around, space between, space evenly. And those seem like things that I might want in like all sorts of different circumstances, right? So when you're like, yeah, I just kind of want all my flex elements to just kind of like spread out, or I want them all over here, I want them all over here. A great place to see if Flexbox can just like solve this problem for you is to just go into your dev tools and like mess with the justify content property. Let's go with space around for now. So that's great, but you notice that after we put this border on here, this is like a pretty big div, right? And let's say we have, I'm gonna make this guy just a little bigger than everybody else. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to demonstrate like what's it like when, that'll work. What's it like when your elements are like different sizes, right? Sometimes you want everything to be, like maybe these are supposed to look like they're all like buildings on the ground. And so if they're all floating in the sky, they don't look like buildings. So what I can do is kind of the complement to the justify content property is the align items property. So justify content works on the main axis, and the align items property works on the cross axis. And if I forget to come back to those terms later, remind me, because they're kind of important. And we see a lot of the same properties here. We have center, centering stuff vertically in CSS is like famously difficult before Flexbox. So centering stuff vertically without Flexbox is like painful and unintuitive and stupid and brittle. Doing it with Flexbox is just like, oh yeah, just put it in the center. We're done here. Align items center. Oh, that didn't work. Justify items center. Yeah, that did it. So we have baseline. Baseline has something to do with like where the text is going to line up. Center end. Flex end, same thing. Flex start. So in this case, because it's the other axis, it's like flex start means the top, flex end means the bottom. And I think I want to find stretch. Yeah, these aren't going to stretch because they have like a set height, but the default for align items is stretch. So what you tend to find is that when you're doing Flexbox stuff, you'll just get all your stuff gets like spaghettied out like that. And you're like, that's weird. I don't want that. It's because your line items property defaults to just stretching everything to fit the maximum size of the container. So in this case, this chartreuse colored fellow wants to be 160 pixels. So everybody's 160 pixels because they're just stretching to, this one's blowing out the container to the height that it wants to be, and everything else is like, okay, yeah, okay, we can be that size, no problem. So yeah, in this case, I can jack this up as much as I want, and all of the items are just like, yeah, okay, I'll follow that plan. That sounds good. And this could be like text, like you want this sidebar to like track with like how much text is in the box. So like the longer the text gets, the longer the sidebar gets. You can do that with stretch. But if that looks silly to you and you don't want that, well, line items has a whole bunch of other properties that do that. In this case, I go flex start, which means they're only taking up as much space as they have to. And the thing that defines that amount of space is that flex grow property. But then, of course, if I turn the height back on, height 80 pixels, they're like, oh yeah, I'm 80 pixels now. Does that make sense? Okay, then that's it for the Flexbox stuff. We're going to talk about the yes question.
I have a question. If I want to move only the blue box, how do I move it just like to the left, just a little bit? Do I have to make another flex box and then like find the width and then move it a little, or?
If you want to move just the blue box, yeah. How do you do it?
Like all the way to the purple one.
All the way to where the purple one is?
Yeah, but just like right after the purple one.
This purple one? Okay, so you want the blue one to go snuggle up beside the purple one?
Just like a little bit towards the right.
I see. So in general, aligning things on the main axis, which means the axis where like, if I'm looking for my neighbors, which way do I look? Do I look left or right, or do I look up or down? Adjusting along the axis, the main axis, along which you have neighbors, is the flex items don't really have a say in that. If you want to align on the cross axis, where like you look up and down and it's like just you, right? In this case, if this element looks up and down, it doesn't have any neighbors that it can collide with. We can grab that neighbor and we can go align self. I did that on all the divs, that's why that happened. See how that's the selector says every div on the page. So I can align on that axis however I want. If I want to align on this axis, then like I need to do something else. Like in this case, I would, if I wanted to do that thing, I would make like a box that takes up this space, probably with flex grow. And then I would tell this to align on that edge of the box. Or I would put the purple thing and the blue thing in the same box, which is kind of like what we did here. We put all the things that we want on the left in one box and all the things we want on the right in another box. And then we push those two boxes apart. Yeah, that's a good point. It would change the distribution between, because then it, like if you wrap, I just pointed at my screen, you can't see what I'm pointing at. If you wrap these two in their own div, then the main container is distributing 4 items instead of 5 items. So that's a good point. What happens if you do padding and margins on a specific element? Do you guys want to, I want to check with like the rest of the class real quick. Do you feel like it's high payoff talking more about Flexbox right now? Because we're going to run out of time. I think Flexbox is really important, but we might like have to skip some other stuff.
What's the other stuff?
SAS and media queries. So I'm going to touch on those briefly, but like I'm really going to just be like, this is a thing that you can do, bye. But do you want to keep talking about Flexbox? Like that's a good use of our time, but it's at the expense of those other things.
Whatever material we don't cover, do you think you like help us type it out maybe and like put in notes so that we could read through it after lecture or something?
I'm glad you asked.
Oh, okay. I'm glad you asked.
Yeah, the lecture notes cover all of that, and so does a bunch of like the curriculum material. And I'm around for like the rest of the day. If you're like, you're supposed to talk about media queries and you didn't, okay, well, I'll come help you. So we're going to keep talking about Flexbox then. Great. So you were asking, can you repeat your question? I forgot. Oh, padding and margin. Yeah, okay. So yeah, padding and margin is pretty important with Flexbox because you end up with, let's say we go like that. Just gonna make this a little bigger now. You can see these all have a little bit of margin right now, and that's the reason that they don't just like butt up against each other, right? So I think if I take those 2 pixels away, they just snuggle up against each other, like 0 pixels between them, right? Flexbox will just shove them right up against each other. Won't make them overlap. Flexbox will never let things overlap unless you like really twist its arm. But it will let you push things like right up against each other. And then if you want there to be a little bit of space between them, then you have to make that happen yourself. So yeah, you can do that with margin. And there are a couple ways to do that. So I'm gonna, which one is this again? Oh, one fluid layout. I'm gonna open this on my machine now. So I'm going to do something radical and just like delete almost all of my CSS. I'm using version control, so that's okay. Okay, so now all our boxes are purple. And they're all the same size, right? Just get my windows arranged. Okay, so this is all the CSS that is on this page right now, right? It's like we have these boxes lined up. They're inside of a section. The section is a flex box. The section is 100 VW. What does VW mean? Viewport width, yeah, exactly. So the viewport is the window, right? More specifically, it's a part of the window that content renders in. So like if you have like a little border around your window, like older browsers used to, that's not the viewport, but it is part of the window. Small distinction. So 100 VW is kind of like, it sort of works like a percent. 100 VW means 100% of the viewport width. We also have the H, if I wanted it to be the height. We have Vmin and Vmax. So Vmin is like whatever the smaller one is. So like if your window's like this, very tall and like this, then your Vmin is the horizontal width, and vice versa if it's like squished like a sandwich. This is display flex, and we want to talk about margin. So there are 2 ways to approach this. One is, I know that every element in here is going to be a div. So that's a decision that I make as a developer, is like, every element inside of this section, and indeed on this page, is going to be a div. So every div is going to have a margin of 2 pixels, and that's going to put a margin between them, right? But it's totally possible that I have like an image in there and a p tag in there and like a span and like a whole bunch of different stuff, right? And maybe what I want to say is every element inside of this section has a margin of 2 pixels. So in that case, I can use a subselector. So what does this selector mean? Yeah, every direct child. Yeah. So the way you might parse this is every section that has a direct descendant that is an anything, these rules apply to. Right? So I could go div, and it would only apply to divs. I could go p, and it would only apply to p tags. I go section p, section div, have both, and it would only apply to p tags and divs that are direct descendants of this section. I'm going to go star because I don't want the rule to be any div that's inside of the section. I want it to be any element that's inside of the section. So I can throw in an image tag without wrapping it. I can throw in an A tag without wrapping it, and it'll behave the same way. So in this case, I'm going to get rid of the margin on the div. I'm going to put the margin on the pseudo selector, not the pseudo selector, the subselector. And then I can throw all kinds of stuff in there, right? So I can go I don't know why I said hello. And now, I don't know what I was thinking. And now this is going to play like, if I put like a border around it. Yeah, you can see that even though that link is not a div, it still plays by the same rules as the divs do. Because the margin, at least with respect to the margin, because the margin doesn't apply to the divs, it applies to every child of the section. So that's how I do that. Similarly, you might notice, the text in here looks kind of cramped, right? I might decide that like everything in there looks kind of cramped. So maybe I have an image and the image looks like really pushed up against the edges of its container. I can do the same thing for padding. Looks all right. Let's make it like, let's try 6 pixels. Yeah, it looks better. So yeah, maybe I decide that I don't want that to apply to the div. No problem. I can say section, children of sections that are A tags get that padding, and the boxes don't. And of course, if I take away that margin, everything will just like jam up against everything else. Sometimes you want that margin, sometimes you don't, right? Like maybe I want this effect where it just looks like one contiguous box broken by a link. Does that answer your question? Cool. Anything else you guys want to know about so far about Flexbox? Pop quiz, how do we get, let's say we want this link, but we want it like centered in this box here. How do we do that? Hmm? You align it to the center. How do you do that? Align self. Yeah, so it's going to be like a little tricky getting like that border to be full height and then the text to center inside of itself, inside of like the full height border thing. So what's going on here is this element is only taking up as much space as it needs. So the height of the text plus the padding we gave it, it's only taking up as much space as it needs, and like the rest is just leaving empty, right? So this is getting like a little crazy, but I believe. The problem is, so these all default to stretch, right? So when I notice that, I can get rid of that. So the problem is, like, we have like 2 concepts that we're dealing with here. One is how does the box that happens to contain this text align and decide how tall it is? And that's a question we're answering with align self, right? So Flexbox doesn't know about this text node. It doesn't know about it. It doesn't care about that. It just sees boxes, right? Like a tag, just a box. Has text in it? Okay, let me know what that text thinks about how wide it should be. But that's it. So the other problem is, how do we align the text inside of that A node? So I think what you can do here, I'm only like 80% sure this is going to work. %100% sure that's going to work. So yeah, you can tell, because like we don't think about this a lot, but like text nodes in the DOM are just like other elements, right? Like the DOM has like a special plan for like turning DOM elements into like things that have behavior, and text, it just goes like, here's some text. But we can like style text independent of the node that it belongs to, right? So this A tag that we created, it's not an A tag that is the text Google. It's an A tag that has a child, which is a text node, that has a text Google. Weird, right? So that's why the A tag itself, we can say you're a flexbox, and you're going to align your items in the center of you, the container. So now this larger flexbox, this big thing that contains all the purple squares and the link, it's telling all of its contents to stretch as tall as they can. And then the flexbox that is this A tag, damn it, that is this A tag, is also a flexbox. And it's telling its contents, which are just this text node, to align in the center. And if we really had to, so it turns out in this case we don't have to do anything spooky. But if we really had to, we could just wrap that A tag in like a div or something, and then tell that div, okay, you're a flex container, align your stuff like so. Does that make sense? Okay, eventually I'm gonna get like kicked out of here. So we're gonna go forward into media queries. I'm just gonna show you what they're like, talk a bit about them, and I'm gonna do the same thing for SAS, and then everybody can go to lunch. Media queries are pretty important. Let's make this full size again. Media queries are pretty important. So I built like this, these cards out, and this is just like some simple, I'm using Flexbox for layout. Like it resizes and spaces things out sensibly because it's Flexbox. But the thing is, like, eventually we're gonna get too small. And I made the decision here that instead of like negotiating, like, okay, you're gonna lose some space in between these items here, like here's how that space is gonna reflow and everything. I was just like, as soon as somebody starts like encroaching on your space, just change plans, different styles, different everything, right? We do that with media queries. So let's look at how that behaves. Boom. So we get to about, as soon as we like start walking into this margin, my code says, no, I'm not having it. You're not touching my layout here. I'm just going to switch plans on you. So the first thing I did was I made the background burlywood instead of blanched almond, I think, to indicate like, yes, the media query is firing. I think that's a good place to start, and we'll look at that in a second. And then the other thing I did was changed everything. So what happened? I was thinking about my information hierarchy. This is the most important, and then I thought this is pretty important, and I don't mind hiding this stuff. If this is a real app, I'd probably have like some, like you could hover over something and like see the user or whatever, but I don't want to do that. So I just go boom, just the profile picture and just the text. I think, yeah, then that's just like the plan for like the rest of this page's life. So this is called a breakpoint. When we hit that point where past a certain pixel width, the plan changes, it's called a breakpoint. And we talked about that. I used that term a little bit when we were looking at the examples, right? It's like, and there's a breakpoint right there where it turns into a hamburger. The way we establish those breakpoints is with media queries. So this is what a media query looks like. We use the directive. A CSS directive is a technical term for something unusual that CSS does. I don't know what directive means. This is a CSS directive at media. You might have seen it for like at font face, at import. You have a few directives like this that say you're doing something special. This isn't a normal CSS rule. So this is how you say the following is a media query. This is a predicate. So another place that you encounter predicates is in JavaScript when you go if do something. Another place you encounter predicates is here in a JavaScript if statement, right? So this is a thing that's going to evaluate to true or false. And whether or not the stuff inside of this block runs is dependent on, or predicated on, whether or not the predicate turns out to be true. So this thing in a media query is the same thing. What we're saying is out to a max width of 45 ems. Does anyone not know what an em is? What's up?
So we said the max width means width, so we only can use pixel, EM, and rem.
You can only use pixel, EM, and rem? Is that what you said?
Yeah, we can only use discrete.
What do you mean?
Like when we set the max width, like, and then mean width for the media query.
Oh, with the media query? You can only set it to pixels, rems, and ems. I'm not sure if that's strictly true. The thing that's kind of true about it is you can't set it to like a percentage, or you can't set it to like a viewport width, because that's like some circular logic, right? Where you can't measure the viewport in terms of how many viewports wide it is. You can, but it's just always 100. So yeah, you need something that you can figure out like, well, how big is an M? Well, you can go look at like the default font size and figure that out. So like 45 ems must be this many pixels. So yeah, your unit here matters. You can't use 100%, that wouldn't make sense. You can't use 100 VH, VW, because that wouldn't make sense. You might be able to use like 45 CH. It's like character widths. It's like kind of like M's but worse. I think you can do points, maybe. And I'm not like 100% sure that those work. I've never tried them, but yeah, your unit has to be something that can evaluate to like an actual pixel width. So what this says is out to a maximum width of 45 ems, apply these rules. So if the width of the page is greater than 45 ems, this thing evaluates to false. None of these rules apply, right? So right now, more than 45 ems wide. And then we know how big 45 ems is because suddenly we get Burlywood. Right? This is Burlywood. Let's change it to red. Change it to medium violet red, just so you believe me. Oh, that's not going to change. Of course that's not going to change. It's on GitHub. Huh. If I do that. Yeah, medium violet red. So yeah, the thing that's going on here is as soon as you hit, as soon as the window is no longer narrower than 45 ems, these rules cease to apply. Now, all of the rules inside of a media query have more specificity than rules outside of a media query. So I don't have to do, like I have, I don't know, elsewhere I have, you know, styling for the body. I say it's blanched almond. I have styling for the section. These styles will all override equivalent styles outside of the media query because the media query is more specific. So yeah, one gotcha when you're trying to import media queries yourself, which I mentioned in the notes, which you're all going to read very carefully. You need this. You need these magic words in there. You need this meta tag. You need to tell it this, or it doesn't work. In Compass, it'll warn you about that too. The notes warn you about that too. But if you like write a media query and you're like, that's weird, I can't get anything to work, it's because like if you don't have these magic words in there, it just won't work. I don't really know why it's like that. I think it's probably a mistake that it's like that. That's just like a thing you gotta know. Yeah. Any questions about media queries? What's up?
So the max width means that the window is not larger than 45?
Yeah, max width means like these styles will apply up to a max width of 45 ems. You can do min width, and that is kind of like the reverse. But yeah, max width means these styles apply until you're bigger than 45 ems. Until you exceed the max width of 45 ems, however you want to think of it. Cool. So we'll talk real quick about Sass. Sass is CSS with superpowers. I'm just going to say a few things about Sass. First, Sass is a preprocessor. What that means is a preprocessor is a piece of software that takes code written in one way and like processes it, and out the other end comes code written another way. So you have a Sass compiler running in your Vagrant machine, maybe, probably. You point it at an SCSS file, which is like CSS but different, and it'll process and spit out like regular CSS that you can just run in the browser. So that's pretty cool. The way we do that is in the lecture notes. But we're going to use command something like this. Your mileage may vary. If you're not using like some other build tools or something, you'll end up doing Sass watch. And what that does is it says Sass is watching for changes. So that means when you change an SCSS file, or a file that matches this pattern, when it will update. So it'll reprocess all of them. So I'll show you real quick what that looks like. I'm in 04 Sass. I have this SCSS file, and then I have this CSS file. So the SCSS file looks a lot like a regular CSS file. And so when you're using Sass, second important thing about Sass, when you're using Sass, you can just write regular CSS and you're okay. There's nothing special or spooky about it. But you also get the benefit of a bunch of interesting features, interesting and useful features. So this looks a lot like regular CSS, but if you look closely, you notice that I'm like doing nesting. So the coolest feature about Sass, I think the only Sass feature that's like still useful, because like regular CSS does most of what Sass does, is you can do nesting. So like in our example where we had like a section star. Remember that from earlier? I wanted to like, you guys remember that, right? Okay. So we did one of those, and then like presumably we also have like a bunch of section styles. instead of doing that, we can have like our regular section styles. So we go like background, medium orchid. And then we can actually nest our other selectors inside of this selector. So instead of going out here, section star, we can just take that part and nest it in there. So that's kind of cool. And it's probably the most useful feature. We can do that for, like, if we want to apply different classes to the section, like maybe it's like blue for information, red for danger kind of thing, right? It's a pattern that you see with Bootstrap. So you go like dot danger color. So now anywhere that I do section.danger or section.info, it's going to go, oh, section, and then nested in section is danger. So this is going to apply to section.danger. Does that make sense? So that's a little nicer than having to go like, section.danger. And then elsewhere go section. If for no other reason than like as you're browsing your styles, you can just fold them up. You can fold them all away and not have to look at the ones that you're not working on. That's pretty cool. So there are a bunch of other features in Sass that I'm not going to show you because we're out of time. Thanks, everybody.
Just a quick question.